Hey there, tonight we're stepping far from the rush of our modern world and into a time cloaked in shadows and ancient beliefs. Forget grand castles and bustling marketplaces. We're journeying to the quiet corners of medieval Europe, where forest met field and raw superstition walked hand in hand with deep faith. Our destination is the untold story of the Sin Eater, that solitary figure who stood between the living and the dead, between salvation and damnation, between a community and its deepest fears. You'll immerse yourself in his twilight existence, understanding what it was like to silently bear the weight of a village's hidden transgressions, forever close enough to call upon, yet never truly a part of the hearth. If this kind of slow, unfolding narrative helps you find your calm and drift towards rest, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing. Only do so if it genuinely offers you tranquility, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. There's a quiet comfort in knowing others are sharing this journey into the past, easing into sleep alongside the same tale. So dim the lights, let your mind settle into the whispers of a distant age, and let's step into the profound world of the Sin Eater. And now the story begins. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, particularly in the misty valleys of Wales, the rugged highlands of Scotland, and the rolling border counties of England, isolated communities practiced a ritual born of equal parts desperation and ancient tradition. When plague took a man without warning, when a traveller died far from any church, when a child passed too young to know confession, villagers turned not to their priests, but to the Sin Eater. Not a holy man, not a scholar, but an outcast who performed the most sacred of tasks through the most profane of means, by eating the sins of the dead. The Sin Eater's world was one of perpetual twilight existence. By day he might be seen gathering fallen apples at the orchard's edge, or mending his single coat in the lee of a hayrick. Children would dare each other to touch his shadow before running away. By night, when death came unexpectedly, a nervous boy would be sent to fetch him, leaving bread and salt on a stump to mark the meeting place. The villagers believed with absolute certainty that sins left unconfessed would bind a soul to earth, bringing crop failures, sick livestock, and stillborn babies. The Sin Eater alone could break this curse. Imagine with me now a specific village frozen in time. The year is 1632, when Charles I sat uneasily on England's throne, and the last witch trials still haunted the countryside. The place is a Shropshire hamlet of perhaps 20 families. Its cottages crouched low against the hills like sheep against the wind. The hour is that uncertain time between sunset and full dark, when shapes blur and the imagination awakens. The liminal hour when such rituals always began. In the largest cottage, its walls blackened by decades of hearth smoke, a strong farmer lies dead. Just this morning he was shouting at his dogs in the yard. Now a fall from his plough horse has left him stretched upon the table, his work-rough hands folded over a sprig of rosemary. His wife has washed the body with water from the sacred well and dressed it in its Sunday best, the same clothes he wore to witness his children's baptisms. Neighbors have brought what food they can spare, not for the dead, but for the ritual to come. At the head of the crude oak table, a loaf of dark rye bread rests upon the farmer's still chest. Beside it stands a wooden cup of weak ale brewed from last autumn's harvest. Outside, the summer air carries the layered scents of turned earth, livestock dung, and the first honeysuckle blooms. Crickets chirp in the uncut grass beyond the fence, their rhythm undisturbed by the occasional muffled sob from within the cottage. Then, cutting through the twilight, a new sound emerges, the slow, dragging footsteps of a man approaching from the forest path, where charcoal burners work by day. The sin-eater moves with the measured weariness of one accustomed to lonely roads. His clothes are ragged but clean, his face weathered beyond its years by exposure and something else, a perpetual squint against unseen weights. He pauses at the threshold, not from respect for the dead, but because he knows better than to enter unbidden. The living might need his service, but they still cross themselves when he passes. The widow opens the door just wide enough to pass the bread and ale outside, her face averted. Neither speaks. The transaction requires no words, only the understanding that what happens next will spare her husband's soul and protect her household from lingering malice. The bread has absorbed the dead man's sins. The ale will wash them down. This is the oldest bargain of all. The sin-eater takes the offerings to a moss-covered tree stump some 20 paces from the cottage. There, beneath the gathering stars, he consumes the bread in methodical bites and drinks the ale in slow swallows. With each mouthful, he is believed to absorb the farmer's unconfessed sins. The time he struck his eldest son in drunken anger, the silver coin he kept when he found it on the road, the neighbor's wife he coveted during last year's May Day dances. The food tastes of nothing but flour and yeast, yet it carries the weight of a man's secret life. When only crumbs remain, the sin-eater rises stiffly. He does not look back at the cottage, where candlelight now flickers in the windows as the proper wake begins in earnest. His payment, 3 copper coins left beneath the stone by the gate, will buy him bread and cheese for another week. His burden, invisible but heavy, will remain with him until his own death, when legend says all accumulated sins will be judged at once. This was the sin-eater's sacred charge through countless generations, not to judge the sins he consumed, not to question their weight or nature, but simply to bear them away so others might rest. In a world that feared the unrested dead more than any earthly hardship, his was the ultimate sacrifice of social exile, forever close enough to call upon, yet never permitted near the hearth. As we explore his story tonight, let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of that distant time. Inhale deeply, imagining the scent of tallow candles and damp wool. Exhale fully, releasing the tensions of the modern world. With each breath, notice how your body settles deeper into relaxation, just as the sin-eater's shoulders bore the weight of others' transgressions without complaint. In the coming hour, we will walk the sin-eater's path through history's fog. We will witness Welsh rituals where salt was sprinkled in the shape of a cross upon the corpse's lips. We will see Scottish Highland variations where the bread was baked with barley from the deceased's own fields. We will follow this tradition to its last recorded practitioner, an old man in 19th century Shropshire who still received occasional calls to his woodland hut. But for now, in these first quiet minutes, simply let the images form behind your closed eyelids. A dirt road silvered by twilight, a loaf of coarse bread warming on a dead man's chest, a solitary figure walking slowly toward a cottage where candles burn low and death waits to be transformed. The night stretches before us, long and still. The story only begins to unfold. Rest your mind as the sin-eater once rested between callings, knowing the work continues, but pausing to gather strength for what comes next. Let your thoughts grow quiet as the village grows dark, and sleep draws near like the sin-eater to his lonely supper. To understand the sin-eater, we must first step further back in time, to the damp, dimly lit world of 16th century rural Europe, a world where the scent of wood smoke clung to wool clothes for weeks, where the average village comprised no more than 20 families clustered around a mill and a meager church. In these isolated communities, death was ever present. Childbirth, plague, and farming accidents claimed lives with brutal regularity. But what truly terrified villagers wasn't death itself. It was the prospect of dying unprepared. The church taught that last rites cleansed the soul of sin, but when someone died suddenly, crushed by a millstone, drowned in a shallow creek, or taken by a fever in the night, their soul risked wandering the earth as a restless spirit. Folk belief held that these unshriven dead could blight crops, sour milk, and even summon storms. The sin-eater emerged as a desperate solution to this fear, bridging pagan traditions and Christian doctrine. The practice likely began in the Welsh marches, that rugged borderland between England and Wales, where Celtic and Anglo-Saxon traditions blurred. Here, in villages like Ludlow and Clun, records mention sin consumers as early as 1587. The ritual was simple but potent. 1. A loaf of bread would be placed on the deceased's chest for 1 hour to absorb sins. 2. A cup of ale, or sometimes salt, set beside it as preservative against corruption. 3. The sin-eater would consume both while reciting, I give easement and rest now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes or in our meadows, and for thy peace I pawn my own soul. Amen. Asterisk. This was no sanctioned sacrament, but a folk practice passed in whispers. The bread, always coarse rye or barley, never fine wheat, represented the dead's earthly burdens. The ale, brewed from the deceased's own grain, when possible, carried their memories. As the sin-eater consumed them, villagers believed the deceased's moral stains transferred to his own soul, leaving the dead cleansed for judgment. But who would willingly take on such a burden? The answer lies in the harsh economics of peasant life. Sin-eaters typically came from society's lowest ranks. Criminals. Avoiding harsher punishments. Record from 1612. Warwick mentions a sheep thief given this role. Disabled persons. Unable to perform manual labour, a 1634 Shropshire account describes a crook-backed man serving this function. War veterans. With missing limbs, noted in Welsh border ballads. Orphans. With no family protection, as referenced in 1598 Hereford Church Ledger. Payment was meagre, a few coins, leftover funeral food, or permission to sleep in barns, yet this paltry compensation came with devastating social costs. Sin-eaters were forbidden from entering churches, touching healthy livestock, courting or marrying, eating from communal dishes. A 1653 diary from Herefordshire describes how villagers would cast their eyes downward when passing a sin-eater's hut, believing even accidental contact could bring misfortune. Children sang rhymes about them. Sin-eater, sin-eater, eats our shame, never speaks his Christian name. Bread and ale is all his worth, walks alone beneath the earth. Yet for all their pariah status, sin-eaters held paradoxical power. Some records suggest they could refuse difficult cases. A 1628 Cheshire scroll mentions a sin-eater rejecting a suicide victim, fearing the weight of self-murder. In Wales, certain families were said to pass the role hereditarily, developing secret rituals over generations. The famed anthropologist Charlotte Byrne documented 19th century Welsh elders, recalling sin-eaters who used oak leaves to wipe the deceased's lips before bread placement, burn the crumbs left after eating to prevent sin redistribution, spat into running water afterward to dilute the spiritual contamination. The Church's stance wavered between tolerance and outright condemnation. While no official doctrine acknowledged sin-eating, regional priests often turned a blind eye, especially in poor parishes where they couldn't attend every death. A 1601 letter from Bishop Bennet of Hereford complains about certain pagan digestions of sin, but admits their persistence in remote valleys. Some clergy even suggested the practice echoed Christ's sacrifice, though they dared not say so publicly. Modern scholars debate its origins. Some trace it to ancient Celtic soul guides who conducted psychopomp rituals, Viking era customs where warriors ate over graves to inherit dead kinsmen's strength, medieval Jewish influences. The Kapparot atonement ritual used bread. What's undeniable is how physically demanding the role became. Sin-eaters often walked 20+ miles between villages, ate spoiled funeral food that made others ill, bore the psychological toll of absorbing trauma. A 1740 physician's journal from Aberystwyth describes a sin-eater's deathbed confession. The sins sit in my belly like stones. I dream of all the hands I never shook. Asterisk. As you listen to the rain outside this imaginary 16th century cottage, consider the sin-eater making his way home, his stomach full of another's transgressions, his pockets holding a few damp coins. The villagers have barred their doors against the storm and against him. He'll sleep tonight in a woodcutter's abandoned lean-to, wrapped in a cloak that smells of mildew and old sweat. This was the reality behind the folklore, not some grand dark wizardry, but a desperate bargain between the living and the dead. The sin-eater took society's fears into his own body so others could sleep soundly. As you drift deeper into this history, notice how your own breathing slows, perhaps in unconscious sympathy with those long-ago outcasts who shouldered invisible burdens. Tonight we witness the ritual itself, not as historians or scholars, but as shadows in the corner of that dim cottage where death has come to stay. Every step will unfold with deliberate slowness, every sensation magnified in the candlelight. Breathe deeply now, and let the years dissolve. The body lies on the kitchen table, the only flat surface long enough to hold a grown man. 3 women from the village have prepared it. They've washed the corpse with water from the eastern well, never the western, for that's where spirits gather. They've stuffed its nostrils with lavender to slow decay's scent. The hands are crossed left over right, a copper penny placed on each eyelid. But one detail chills you most. The dead man's mouth hangs slightly open, as if frozen mid-sentence when his soul departed. At the head of the table, a loaf of barley bread, baked yesterday for this very purpose, rests upon the corpse's chest. You notice two curious details. First, the bread bears the faint imprint of the dead man's work-worn fingers where he kneaded dough just last week. Second, a single long hair, blonde like his youngest daughter's, sticks to the crust. No one removes it. This bread must carry all that remains. Beside it sits a wooden cup of small ale, the weak daily drink of peasants. The liquid surface reflects the candle flame, making it appear to burn from within. A pinch of salt floats near the rim, though whether this is intentional or from the brewer's hands, no one can say. The villagers withdraw now, not respectfully, not quietly, but with the haste of those fleeing contagion. A woman knocks over a stool in her hurry. A man makes the sign of the cross backward, his fingers trembling. Within moments, the cottage stands empty but for you, the corpse, and the sin-eater, who now steps from the shadows. He moves differently than you expect, not with theatrical grimness, but with the tired precision of a man performing a familiar task. His hands, knuckled and scarred, hover briefly over the bread. You see him inhale through his mouth, never the nose, for the dead smell carries misfortune. Then comes the chant, spoken in a dialect so old, even some villagers barely understand. I give easement and rest, now to thee, dear man. Come not down the lanes, nor in our meadows. For thy peace I pawn my own soul's keeping, in the name of him who walked in shadow. Amen. The eating begins, not the performative bite of church communion, but the pragmatic chewing of a starving man. The bread is stale. It crackles between his teeth like autumn leaves underfoot. You watch his throat work to swallow each dry mouthful. Between bites, he drinks the ale in careful sips, his Adam's apple bobbing like a boat on rough water. Here's what no ballad mentions: the taste. This bread has absorbed the corpse's cooling sweat, the lavender from its nostrils, the iron tang of blood still pooling in its extremities. The ale carries notes of the dead man's last meal, onion soup and turnips. The sin-eater consumes it all without flinching, but you see his fingers tighten around the cup at certain moments, perhaps when a particular sin passes his lips, a stolen kiss, a lie that split a family. The bread offers no answers, only wait. When only crumbs remain, the sin-eater performs 3 final acts with ritual solemnity. 1. He wipes his mouth with his sleeve, always the left sleeve, never the right, the side closest to the heart. 2. He breaks the wooden cup against the hearthstone, ensuring it can never be used for happier purposes. 3. He places the remaining crust on the corpse's tongue, the devil's share, to prevent haunting. Then comes the most unnerving moment of all, the silence. No birds sing outside, no mice scuttle in the thatch. Even the dripping water seems to pause. In this absolute stillness, the sin-eater and the dead man might be the last 2 souls on earth. You find yourself holding your breath without meaning to. At last the spell breaks. The sin-eater exhales sharply through his nose, a sound like wind through a hollow tree. The corpse's mouth has closed, you realize, whether from settling muscles or some less earthly cause. It now wears the faintest smile. Outside, a rooster crows, though dawn remains hours away. The sin-eater leaves as he came, without ceremony. He pockets the copper pennies from the corpse's eyes, his rightful payment, but leaves the lavender. At the threshold, he pauses just long enough to kick dirt over his footprints in the sod floor. Then he's gone into the night, his shadow merging with the shapes of sleeping trees. You remain alone with the corpse now. The candle burns lower, its wax pooling around a dried sprig of rosemary. Notice how your own body has changed during this vigil. Your fingers have curled like the dead man's. Your jaw has clenched against the taste of imagined bread. Consciously relax them now. Let your hands lie open, palms upward, like the sin-eater's when his work is done. Breathe out the stale air of the cottage. Breathe in the cool dampness drifting through the open door. This ritual ended centuries ago, yet something of its weight lingers in our bones. Perhaps that's why your eyelids grow heavy now, not just from sleep's approach, but from the accumulated weariness of all those long-ago midnights, when bread turned to sacrament in a dead man's house. No one ever asked what happened after the ritual. The villagers blew out their candles and slept soundly, their dead now sanitized. The priest recorded the death without mention of the shadowy figure who made Christian burial possible. But the sin-eater, he walked through fields where morning frost glittered like discarded coins, past cottages where hearth smoke curled invitingly from chimneys, never for him. His feet knew every dear path and dry stream bed between parishes, for the roads belonged to decent folk. This was the truth of his existence, a lifetime of walking the edges, both literal and spiritual. Consider his nights. While others slept on straw ticks, he made beds in places that would accept him. The leeward side of churchyards, not among the consecrated graves, but near the suicide's corner where the earth stayed soft. Abandoned charcoal burners' huts, their walls blackened by old fires that left no warmth. Haylofts, but only after ensuring the farmers' dogs were chained. More than one sin-eater woke to snapping teeth. Beneath hedgerows, in summer where the thorns scratched his face, but the birds didn't shun him. The cold seeped into his bones differently than most, not the sharp chill of winter mornings, but the damp, persistent cold of stone floors in empty places. His knees ached from nights spent curled against cellar walls. His fingers grew stiff, the nails perpetually cracked from scraping frost off tree bark to suck for moisture. Children's voices carried farthest. Their taunts followed him like echoes. Sin sack, devil's mouth, Shropshire, 1623. Your shadow's got no soul. Welsh Marches, 1618. Our mom says you'll eat us next. Hereford, 1631. The stones they threw left bruises that took weeks to fade. Once, near Ludlow, a girl no older than 6 placed a crust of bread in the road, not as offering, but as bait. When he reached for it, older boys whipped his hands with willow switches. He ate the bread anyway, dirt and all. Even animals recoiled. Dogs that welcomed beggars and thieves would stiffen at his scent, their hackles rising like bristles on a brush. Cats arched their backs and spat. In one account from 1598, a miller's prized ferret, trained to hunt rats, refused to enter a room where a sin-eater had slept the previous night. The church's rejection cut deepest. Though his labor made Christian burial possible, priests barred him from entering naves. He could stand in the rain by the north door during services, receiving last rites, a cruel irony noted in a 17th century monk's marginalia. Being buried in consecrated ground, his grave would be marked with a stake, not a cross. A Welsh chronicle tells of one sin-eater who tried to attend Easter Mass in 1602. The congregation exited en masse, leaving the priest to finish the sacrament before an empty church. The man's footprints in the snow outside showed where he'd paced for hours, waiting for a forgiveness that never came. His possessions, few as they were, carried their own isolation. A wooden bowl, never washed for fear the sins might leak into groundwater. A knife with a broken tip, used to cut burial bread, never food. A waxed cloak, stiff with other people's death sweat, up to rosary with missing beads. Salvaged from a grave, its prayers incomplete. Each item told the same story, cast-offs and remnants, like the man himself. The fire you hear now is one he's built himself, far from any village. Watch how he tends it, not for warmth but for light. The flames reveal what daylight hides, his left little finger, missing its tip, frostbite during a winter spent in an unburied trapper's shack. The scar above his eyebrow, from a rock thrown at Carmarthen in 909. The co-stained grooves in his teeth, from biting down on leather during particularly foul rituals. Most telling are his eyes, not their color, that's long since faded from memory, but how they skip over reflective surfaces, puddles, well water. Even the polished tin cup by his feet goes deliberately unused. A man who's swallowed hundreds of souls learns to avoid mirrors. There were moments, though, rare and precious as sunlight in November, a shepherd's widow who left mutton broth by the standing stones every full moon, at a blind rope maker who talked to him about the weather, never asking his trade. An old soldier who once shared cider and said, "We both carry dead men, friend." These small mercies sustained him like the weak ale he drank, just enough to continue, never enough to forget. The isolation reshaped his body. Note how he walks slightly sideways, as if making room for unseen companions, holds his breath when passing healthy livestock, for their protection, not his, sleeps sitting up, back against a tree or wall. No man who's eaten ghosts dares lie vulnerable. His voice, when he uses it, sounds like wind through a hollow log, not from disuse, but from the weight of all those swallowed confessions. Parish records mention sin-eaters who eventually lost speech entirely, communicating only through gestures as intricate as monks' sign language. And always, always the dreams, not of the dead he'd cleansed, they at least had moved on, but of the living who'd spat at his shadow. Their faces floated behind his eyelids. The miller's daughter, who'd laughed when her hound bit him. The blacksmith, who'd paid him in nails instead of coin. The priest, who'd blessed the bread before placing it on the corpse, but never the hands that ate it. They came most often in the hour before dawn, when the world hangs suspended between darkness and light, the same hour when, in village after village, frantic messengers would come looking for him. This was the sin-eater's true penance, not the eating, but the afterward, the endless walking, the knowledge that every soul he helped free tightened his own bonds. No sacrament awaited him. No kindly hand would press bread to his chest when his time came. Only the earth and whatever creatures might gnaw his bones. As you listen to this slow, solitary heartbeat, let it lull you deeper. Feel how your own breath comes easier than his ever did, how your bed accepts you without conditions, how the darkness around you now is soft, not accusing. The sin-eater walks still in the shadows between history and memory, but here, in this quiet moment, you may rest. He carried the weight so others could sleep. Tonight, that includes you. Time, that great eraser of traditions, finally came for the sin-eaters too. By the early 1800s, the practice had retreated to the most isolated valleys, places where the modern world arrived late, if at all. The Industrial Revolution brought railroads and reason, leaving little room for men who bargained with the dead. Churches that once turned a blind eye now openly condemned the ritual. In 1823, the Bishop of Hereford called it a heathenish superstition unfit for Christian souls. Medical journals labeled it morbid folklore. Even the villagers who'd once relied on sin-eaters began to whisper that perhaps the dead could manage their own sins. Yet in a few shadowed corners, the old ways clung like lichen to stone. The last confirmed sin-eater worked his grim trade in the Shropshire hills near Rattling Hope. His name was Richard Munslow, though few dared speak it aloud. When he died in 1906, not from any spiritual burden, but a simple farmer's pneumonia, the London papers briefly noted the quaint custom's final practitioner. They got most details wrong. The truth was quieter and sadder. Munslow hadn't chosen his role. It came to him through tragedy. In 1854, his 3 young children died within a week of each other, likely from diphtheria. The local vicar refused to bury them, claiming the family was cursed. That night, under a full moon, Munslow performed the sin-eating ritual for his own children. When the village saw he'd survived the encounter, they began calling him to other deaths. A man broken by grief became the receptacle for others' fears. His tools were simpler than his medieval predecessors, a plain wheat loaf. No longer barley, the old grain had disappeared, a tin mug of weak tea. Ale being too dear for poor farmers, the same 4-line chant, though now spoken in English, not the old dialect. The rituals themselves grew shorter. Where once a sin-eater would spend hours preparing, Munslow's services rarely lasted 20 minutes. The dead were no less feared, but patience for the old ways had thinned like winter sunlight. A doctor's journal from 1892 records the only known description of Munslow at work. Found a fellow in a crofter's cottage near the Stiperstones. The corpse, a shepherd, had been dead 3 days. Munslow ate the bread with the haste of one performing an unpleasant but familiar task. When finished, he refused payment, asking only for nails to mend his leaking roof. The widow crossed herself behind his back as he left. Asterisk, note what's missing. No mention of the chant, no description of the bread's placement. By then, even educated observers saw only the shell of the ritual, its marrow long since lost. The world changed around Munslow like a river eroding its banks. 1874. The new cemetery rules forbid unconsecrated burials. 1889. A traveling preacher calls sin-eating Satan's sacrament. 1898. The last village elder who remembered the old chants dies. By century's end, he was less a necessary outcast than a living museum piece. Children dared each other to touch his coat. Tourists asked to photograph his hands. The very isolation that preserved his role now made it absurd. Munslow's final years were spent in a tumble-down cottage near Snail Beach. Neighbors left food on his stoop, not as payment, but charity. The local vicar, a kinder man than his predecessor, recorded one haunting detail. The old man would save crumbs from every meal, arranging them in careful lines on his windowsill. Whether this was dementia or some last ritual, none could say. When death came for the last sin-eater on January 6, 1906, it did so without ceremony. No bread was placed on his chest, no ale set by his side. The vicar permitted burial in consecrated ground, but ordered the grave dug at the far edge of the churchyard, a compromise between Christian mercy and lingering superstition. His gravestone still stands in Rattling Hope churchyard, though the elements have worn the inscription smooth in places. If you visit today, you might find odd offerings left there. Coins, always face down. Bread crusts, now nibbled by birds rather than men. Pebbles, arranged in spiral patterns. No one remembers why they do this. The gestures persist like a phantom limb, an ache without a source. With Munslow's passing, the chain snapped. The knowledge of how to properly place the bread, when to speak the chant, which herbs prevented spiritual reflux, all vanished into the ground with him. Modern scholars debate whether he truly was the last. Folklorists tell of a Welsh hill farmer who performed the ritual as late as 1913. But these are ghosts of stories, fading with each retelling. The practice didn't so much die as dissolve, like sugar in tea, like mist under morning sun, like the final note of a funeral bell. By World War I, when death came on an industrial scale, no one recalled the man who used to eat its sting away. The war poets wrote of lost generations, but never of the lost profession that once shepherded them. Now only fragments remain, a gay handwritten chant in a Herefordshire archive, a wooden bowl in the Ludlow Museum, mislabeled as beggar's dish. The half-folk rhyme. Children still sing without understanding. Bread on chest, ale in hand, sin-eater walks the shadowland, eats our wrongs for penny fee. leaves us clean, but who cleans he? Asterisk. As you listen to this clock marking time, where no sin-eater remains to measure it, notice how your own breathing has changed. Slower now, deeper. The weight of these centuries-old sorrows is not yours to carry. Let each exhale release you further, from Monslow's grief, from the village's fear, from the long silence that followed when the last professional mourner of sins took his secrets underground. The story ends as all stories do, with forgetting. No bread waits on your chest tonight. No unseen sins cling to your breath. Only rest remains, patient and forgiving as the Shropshire hills that finally claimed the last sin-eater.